All right, I have a couple announcements before we begin with agenda item number 3, the Students' Rights and Responsibilities Manual, going over that. We are going to eliminate agenda item number 5, citizen participation procedures, to another date. Date not yet certain, is that correct? Okay, but we will do that. We will have there's a possibility of some weather. We will have an announcement about that if we need to leave early. We all want to get home safely. And Miss Evans and I both, due to personal commitments, one of us, depending if the weather is not an issue, Miss Evans has to leave at 4:30, I have to leave at 5. Miss Strauss will then become the meeting manager for whatever remaining portion of the meeting is left. So with that, I would like to begin introducing everyone here today. Thank you all for coming and being part of this presentation to us. We have Miss Teresa Johnson, the Assistant Superintendent of DSS. We have Miss Mary Ann Panarelli, the Director for the Office of Intervention and Prevention Services. We have... Yes, Dr. Miss Mary Ann Panarelli. I'm sorry. We have Stefan Maskell, the Coordinator of Student Safety and Wellness. We have Dave Jagels, the Principal of Centerville Centerville Elementary School. High School. Oops. Sorry. And we have Mr. Martin Grimm, the Principal of Hayfield Secondary. And Tim Thompson, Principal of Annandale High School. So thank you all for coming. We appreciate it. Today, just a few notes before we get started. Today we are going to, basically, just a reminder to school board members that the SR&R is a document about setting the rules, not what happens after that. This document, the changes are based upon legislative changes, small changes added for clarity, and some prevention efforts that we will talk about. And when you look at the presentation as we go through the PowerPoint, you will see that items highlighted in red are items that are, well, that's clear that they are struck out, but the blue items are new. And now I will call upon Ms. Johnson to begin. And thank you again.
So good afternoon. I just want to thank the principals for being here. We also have Mr. Frank Trampa and Gordon Sykes here from middle school to answer any questions about the middle school. Again, as Ms. Koufax shared, we are going to be talking about the legislative updates and the clarifying information that we've added into the SR&R. And we'll end the presentation by sharing some of our expanded efforts at prevention. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Panarelli.
And I wanted to be sure, actually, Karen Keys-Gamar's not here. For those people who maybe were not here or have not seen, you don't have children, haven't necessarily seen, this is last year's, so the current school year's SR&R. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that the front of the book is a parent guide. So it is written in positive what we expect of children. We take the opportunity to highlight some things that may not have to do with rules, but have to do with resources in the schools, et cetera. We have these little sort of call-out things where something is highlighted to try to draw parents' attention to something. In the back of the book are regulations, so regulations that are about acceptable use of electronics, as well as the regulation that is what we call the SR&R, so 2610. So what we're discussing today are changes that we've made to 2610. So sometimes that gets a little bit confusing and people are asking us to put things in the SR&R when they really mean this is something we should highlight for parents. So I'll go through that a little bit as we go forward. But I just wanted you to understand that some years ago when there was a recommendation, we had a committee and they recommended that there be a parent-friendly way to communicate information and to sort of highlight resources. We looked at similar books across the country and found that many of them included important information for parents that might not be specifically in the code of conduct, but would be information that we would want parents to have. So I just wanted you to have this as a reference point. The other thing I will draw your attention to is on pages 17, 18, 19. and 20 probably. There are charts there that sort of help parents understand what typical responses might be. This doesn't necessarily limit the possibility of responses, but it does point out which things are mandatory referrals to the superintendent, which kinds of things must be under code reported to the police, et cetera. So this format that you see on 17, 18, and 19 is one that's recommended by groups that are trying to address things like disproportionality and other issues. And so that was why we included it in the parent guide, so that they would have a better idea. So as has been said, the information you're going to get today is sort of broken into two large buckets. One of them are actual changes that we're making to the wording of the SR&R, and they were driven primarily because there have been changes in the law in Virginia. So there are some legislative updates, as well as information for clarity. So over the course of the year, we keep track of what calls we get from parents, what calls we get from principals, and where there are areas that we can add greater clarity, we have tried to do that. Beyond that, because these three topics, vaping, social media, and attendance, are things that we have heard a great deal of discussion about in media, from parents, from other people, we wanted to highlight for you that in some cases there are not specific changes to the SR&R because there's not been a change in the rules around some of those things, but we are going to talk to you a little bit about some of the prevention efforts that we are doing with the schools to try to address these issues. So as we said, if you look at this first page as the example, what you see crossed out in red was language that was in last year's SR&R, the one you have in your hand. What is in the blue is new language that's being added, and anything that's in the black was there before. So this was a change that is being implemented because there was a change in the legislation about what is a long-term suspension. So previously, a long-term suspension would go anything between 10 days and 365 days. The law was changed so that it would be anything between 10 days and 45 days, except in certain circumstances. And the circumstances are statutory weapons, illegal drugs, serious bodily injury, and what they've called an aggravating circumstance. We will add the definition of an aggravating circumstance to the SR&R when it is provided to us by the state. But at this point, we have not gotten a definition of what an aggravating circumstance is because this was passed by the legislature. Now VDOE has to come through and say this is what the regulation is. Again, the biggest area where we have seen a change is one that I am encouraged by because I think it was important, and that was in the area of attendance. As some of you may know, previous legislation in the area of attendance was very, in terms of truancy, was very dictating in terms of what you needed to do if there were 5 days of unexcused absence, 6 days of unexcused absence, 7 days of unexcused absence, including a requirement for a referral to the courts for 7 days of unexcused absence. Most jurisdictions in Fairfax County were not in very good compliance with those various requirements in terms of when plans were written, when conferences were held, and certainly not when we decided that it was a situation that required court involvement. So the legislation has actually been revised, rewritten, so that it addresses some of those concerns. As we looked at what we currently had in the SR&R, we realized that this, in the red there, that described justifiable absences was not language that was in the law, and we were trying to align our language. There still are excused and unexcused absences. They were just never referred to before as justifiable. I'm not really even sure when Fairfax County put that in there, but we decided we wanted to be consistent with the law. We did add this one paragraph about chronic absenteeism. That is not required under the law, but it is something that is an important focus. It is part of the standards of accreditation, as you all know, and so we wanted to have a way to sort of in addition to the front of the book, to just bring it to the parents, the definition of what chronic absenteeism was, to parents' attention. So that in the blue is simply what the definition is of a chronic absence, which means absence for any reason for more than 10% of the school year. So again, in terms of the unexcused absence and the excused absence, we were trying to come into consistency with state and, in fact, with our own regulations, which have been relatively recently updated. And so we just are giving principals a little bit more guidance on what kinds of things would be typically considered unexcused. You will notice that there is still some discretion on the part of the principal because there are so many unique situations that might come forward that on the face of it might sound like something that ought to be excused, but because of repeated interactions with the parents around a particular issue, the principal may determine that it is an unexcused absence. There are situations, for example, where we ask for medical documentation of an illness that has, the kid has been out a lot. And sometimes we don't get that. So this information, again, was more of a clarification kind of piece. This is the piece that I think is the most important pieces of the change. As I said, this is about truancy, so unexcused absences. And basically, it continues to say that at day 5, if there are 5 unexcused absences, we will reach out to the parents and we will develop a plan to try to improve the absences. We are already doing that, but we want to be sure that so that continued to be part of the law. Then the time frame for having a conference or for bringing the parents back together was made more flexible so that the schools have the opportunity, if they have made a plan, for example, and the next day the child has their 6th absence, we did not want to have to automatically turn around and have a conference when we just had developed the plan. So this gives up to 10 days for the schools to try to go back and make sure the plan is working, et cetera, before it is suggested that if the problem is continuing, then we probably need a multidisciplinary team to gather around and see what barriers are really impacting. So that was changed. And then it's a small change in a word, but we all know how much that much can do. When you get beyond that, it continues to allow us to take a case to court if we need to, but we don't have to. So I personally was very pleased with this particular change. And
can I just say, as a former high school principal, that's a huge change. And Cynthia and I were talking, we pushed to get this. It's really going to give our high school and middle school folks a lot more flexibility in really meeting the needs of the kid instead of swamping people with meeting over meeting and then referring them to the courts. The courts don't want all this truancy in their courts anyway. They want us to figure out school community partners together coming up with solutions for kids. So
right.
Big win, and our lobbying helped make the difference.
Yep. Okay, this again, and this is a fairly large change here. Currently, our SR&R says that a principal may suspend up to 5 days, and if the case is one that is being referred to the hearings office, may suspend up to 10 days. The state legislature is restricting the use of a 5-day suspension for kindergarten through 3rd grade students. That's 5 consecutive days for kindergarten through 3rd grade students. So this first change is just stating that. It is the next page. It is saying you can only do it for 3 days instead of for 5 days. The rest of the divisions across the state didn't. They said up to 10. We had made a revision a few years ago when we were reforming other pieces that said that principals would only use up to 5 unless it was something that was going to the hearings office. This says for kindergarten through 3rd grade, it can only be 3 days, except in this long list of things, again, which tend to be those more serious things: having a weapon, having possessed or used illegal drugs, being subject to a juvenile court report, I don't know, K through 3, being involved in physical harm or credible threat of physical harm, having violated the SR&R, again with a term, with aggravating circumstances. We are kind of waiting for what the state means by aggravating circumstances. In any event, if there was a very serious situation with a K through 3 student, the principal would still be allowed to extend. So this would not say, regardless of what the situation is, you could only suspend for 3 days. In the more serious ones, which typically would be those that were getting referred up to the hearings office. Anyhow, they may go up to the 10 days. This is a statement that we put in as a clarifying piece of information. Again, it was just trying to draw attention to the fact that we expect good use of social media, and that students are supposed to respect the rights of others. They're supposed to refrain from the use of profanity and hurtful messaging. Depending on specific circumstances, failing to adhere to these standards could lead to consequences under the SR&R. So if a child is using their own device at home and sends something mean to somebody, we don't really have jurisdiction over that unless that somehow then creates a disruption in the school and we have some nexus. So it is an area of confusion, and we just wanted to put this in. We also said that FCPS has specific use about FCPS devices and FCPS internet, and that those are all covered already in the acceptable use policy, which is also in the book. So it was an attempt not to just restate everything that was already in there, but just remind parents that that is available. A lot of the changes here are that with the creation of the Ombudsman's Office, certain responsibilities are shifting from what was HR, equity, and employee over to the Ombudsman's Office. Those things that have to do with discrimination or harassment are shifting over to this new office. So 2 of the changes you see here is just to update the information with the correct titles and the correct contact information. The last one down here, which Stefan might have to move out of the way for, is we had already had language in the SR&R that talked about electronic cigarettes, but there was some concern that students were not necessarily associating electronic cigarettes with a Juul, for example, some other vaping device. So this explicitly uses those words, a smoking or vaping device, such as a vape, a Juul, or like device. It also, because we have been getting reports that, so possession is, you're not supposed to do that, and it falls under the principals have discretion for what they do in response to that, but it just specifically calls that out. What is in the device when the device is found may impact what the actual consequences are. So we tend to think of it as a nicotine delivery system, and that is what it is used most often for. However, it can also be used, the same device can also be used for wax that has THC or oil, THC oils. So in some cases, it may be a marijuana offense. And we have recently heard from parents, really, we're picking this up in a little bit in the literature, is that kids are taking the capsules and filling them with alcohol, like with vodka, and then using them to inhale, which delivers a really strong hit to the lungs. So again, what we tried to do was say, you're not allowed to have the device, period. But if you have the device and you're using it for one of these other things, it's not going to just be treated as a tobacco offense in that particular case. Again, we went to where we had it in the tobacco and explicitly said vaping products, smoking devices such as a Juul. It was just an attempt to raise attention about this, and as I said, there's going to be some more information about actual prevention efforts that we're doing. We sometimes get questions about how to appeal, where do I appeal a short-term suspension. So we wanted to clarify that if the student was suspended for 10 days or less, and there was no referral to the division superintendent, then the principal would be the person that you would send your appeal to. Whenever there is a referral to the division superintendent, the hearings office will hear the appeal as part of the overall hearing, so there's no need to first go to the principal. So we just tried to make the words clearer there, that in one case you're going to go to the principal, in the other case you will go it'll be covered as part of the overall hearing. Now, in terms of some things that are not, they're sort of beyond the SR&R, because as we know, the SR&R does explicitly state our expectations, but for most kids, they're not going to, they're going to get our lessons about SR&R, but they're not going to sit and read the words in the SR&R. And we need to go way beyond words anyhow when we're trying to get kids to change their behaviors. So particularly in the area of vaping, we have seen a very significant increase in kids possessing vaping devices. When we look at disciplinary things, because we had grouped vaping with tobacco, you'll see tobacco violations were very low, and suddenly they have spiked way up high, and they're all related to vaping. The kids actually are still pretty, like, I wouldn't smoke. That would be dangerous. Instead, I'm going to use this device. So we are planning to include a segment in the student video, a question or two on the SR&R quiz that the middle and high school kids take. We will continue to provide one-on-one student interventions as we have. Some years ago, we moved away from tobacco seminar being a seminar kids came to and started going to the kids so that they didn't miss as much school. We've been somewhat taxed by that this year because of the high numbers. But to the extent that we can, our plan is to continue to do those one-on-one interventions. We feel like this is a topic that we really need to reach out to parents and help them understand, because a lot of parents are totally unaware that these devices exist, that kids are using them, et cetera. So we're going to be doing some community presentations. I think one of the things that was sent to you was a video that was recently sent out via all the FCPS channels to parents that gave them a little bit of background on the devices. And we're working on creating a parent-focused webpage that we have the webpage. We're working on building out additional information. This is one of these topics that we, Stefan in particular, is getting information from the various national prevention groups like every day. And there's new research being done. And so as we get new information, our plan is to continue to update both our presentations and the website. It is not on here, but vaping is also explicitly addressed in the health curriculum, and the word starts in 6th grade and goes on. So just that's another place where the kids are, and it's within the context of what are the dangers to your body by doing this is how the health curriculum is. The area of social media, again, there are the things that we can legislate, and then there are the things that we can do in terms of raising awareness and prevention activities. So again, we do already, and we will continue to do a lot of student, staff, parent, and community presentations. We plan to, in the front of the book, have a special, like one of the things that draws your attention to it, like something like this, that will talk about social media and the responsible use of social media. And also a reminder that threats to harm others or damage to school property, as well as obscenities and any form of a threat is actually against the law in Virginia. And so we want to be sure that people are aware of that. And then in terms of the chronic absenteeism, there is a tremendous amount of work, thanks to Cindy Dickinson and a large task force of people that include people from the county, from nonprofits, and a lot of school people who have been working on trying to do a media campaign around how absences add up. 10% of the school year is roughly 18 days. It's different if there's snow days. It's different if different things happen, but it's roughly 18 days. And if a child is enrolled the whole time, you can miss 2 days a month and have that add up to 10% absenteeism. And then that 10% marker was used because of the significant impact it can have on learning. And it typically, you'll see if young children are absent a lot, they may not be reading on grade level in third grade. For 7th and 8th graders, we see some failed coursework. And then for high school, we certainly see it get you off track for graduation and things like that. Some of the things that we are doing with our community partners are listed here. Again, the campaign. We're also trying to review the reasons parents give for why their children were out and see if there are some sort of group root causes, if you will. So if we see in a particular school that we're having a lot of parents say their kids are out for asthma, then we plan to work with the health department to see if there's something in that community that is an asthma risk factor that perhaps could be addressed through a public health campaign in that community, for example. At a neighborhood level, this is the same thing, sort of neighborhood social issues or other issues. In some cases, I have not personally heard of this, but in other parts of the country, they often report that if the kids don't feel that there's a safe passageway to school, if they feel that there might be some danger to them in getting to school, then that may be, again, an area that we can address with county partners, parks and planning, whoever, to try to ensure that the kids have safe passage to school. Really spinning off something that was done in the Mount Vernon area by a group of a team of students some years ago, we have created heat maps that look at where kids with chronic absenteeism live within a certain pyramid, and find that in some pyramids they're just sort of spread out randomly across everywhere. In other pyramids they cluster within 3 or 4 block areas. And so our county partners, who often have community workers who work in those areas or in housing complexes in those areas or whatever, are offering to, we can't give them this child is absent, go to their house, but we can say within this 4 block range, a lot of people are absent. Can you help us go door to door and have conversations with people about the importance of going to school? And if they don't have a child, they can be a community person talking to children who are there to say, gee, it's important for you to go to school. We've had great support from IT developing some new data tools for tracking absenteeism and the interventions that are being put into place. And then there will be a specific targeting of schools who have high rates of chronic absenteeism, really primarily to make sure they are aware of all the resources and work with them hand in hand to look at their data and try to be sure that we can get community supports if that's going to be helpful. So that is the end of the presentation.
Well, thank you so much. And board members, I have 3 that are on the docket to ask questions. Don't forget, in addition to our staff, we have principals here. So if you're concerned about how a particular change may impact a school, I think that's a perfect opportunity for us to ask our principals. And I have Ms. Palchek, followed by Ms. Schultz, followed by Ms. Corbett-Sanders.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for the presentation and the principals for being here today. A lot of these look like very positive movements based more on supporting the needs of kids and going a little away from purely punitive ways to address it. I had a couple of very specific questions. Sorry, I'm trying to go back. So my question is, I'm trying to figure out which slide. With the social media one. I like the way you explained, that was slide 11, I believe. Yes, that one. So I really liked, Ms. Panarelli, the way you explained, and I think is often confusing for students and parents, even if it happens off of school grounds, property, the impact, the disciplinary consequences can still happen. So I guess I'm wondering, is it possible to put that more explicit language in there. I think we're kind of talking around it a little bit.
We went back and forth with our attorneys and looking at things other people had put in. One of the problems is the more explicit you get, the more there's something outside that explicit thing that you've said. And so people will say, well, you didn't say that. Plus, kids are always ahead of us in this particular thing. So it really ends up being, and maybe the principals can talk about this, I know it takes a tremendous amount of their time as people come in with these areas of concern, how different one case can be from another.
Yeah, I guess I also want to know, I mean, can it be as simple as just saying, even if it happens off of school grounds?
No, because it's not always going to be something that we will have authority over if it happens off of school grounds, right?
Right. But sorry, go ahead.
Well, I can kind of think of two examples where this happens. If two kids get on social media and arrange to have a physical conflict behind the giant, and and the parent says, "Well, here's an example of my kid's been bullied or whatever." That's all true, but we don't have necessarily nexus to the school. Versus, I'll meet you in the bathroom, or that's where the nexus comes in. I think the danger is, and the conundrum, and I can let other people speak too, for us is, there's a lot of things that happen off the school day that indirectly we could pull into the school day. But if that was the case, almost literally everything that happens on the weekends or off, snow days are good for this or bad for this. It's amazing how much stuff happens online on snow days. So then pulling that nexus into the school would probably triple our what we would be looking into, depending on how specific it was.
Right. I guess I'm trying to understand, just to be more clear. I appreciate that, how we can, and I'm not a lawyer, legally be more clear with students and families that it's, not limited to events that occur on school property. And whether it's here or in the information, we share, I just feel like it's really important to be very explicit, because I think we have many students who don't realize that, things they do outside of school time and property could, have a disciplinary impact in school. I'm trying to figure out how we help students have that information.
Yeah, I think that there is a possibility that we can be a little bit more expansive, if you will, in the sort of parent guide to, just add a sentence that says, including things that happen off school grounds, if they cause a disruption in the school or, something. But but once we get into the regulation, then it has to be legally defensible. And then we get into a whole thing. And I also think that there is a little concern, I don't want to speak for you, about parents bringing in every single thing that happens off of school grounds and expecting the school to be the solution.
No, I agree with all of that. And really just want to make sure, especially for kids who maybe just aren't aware, really, so they have the information ahead of time. It could be very simple, as could be off of school. We don't have to get too specific, but I think it would be helpful for families and kids to know that could have an impact. Because I think they're sometimes surprised that we maybe, look at the text on their phones, and even if they were outside of school hours, that it has an impact. So that was my main question. If there's a way to address that, I would appreciate it. And then my other question was about the ombudsman, just a clarification, and I think it's great that we have that. And I don't have the different roles we're creating under the equity office in front of me right now, but I was just wondering if the school-based diversity liaison, I forget what we're calling them. I don't know if Dr. Duran is here. He's not. Okay. So I don't know if you can speak to, right, we want to make sure that legally it's under the ombudsman, but just want to know, because sometimes it's easier to go to someone in your building than to go to central office.
Again, typically with a concern about harassment and discrimination, it goes through the school, but we want the parent to know that they can go above the school and and because the ombudsman is going to fill the role of Title IX coordinator and a couple other roles, it has to be sort of legally in somebody's world.
Okay.
And Dr. Duran suggested that this was the right wording.
Okay, that's important. And maybe here or for the future, we can kind of define at the school level where parents can go if there is a concern. Okay, thank you.
Ms. Schultz?
First of all, I'm very excited about some of the reductions and some of the lengths of suspensions. I don't know if that makes principals happy or unhappy, but I actually think, Mr. Graham, you got right to it on even a snow day. It can propel things that we don't necessarily intend kids to be doing. And I guess, Dr. Brabrand, in the mission of one-pagers, I almost wonder, like I asked in the previous work session, if we can't just have like a upfront statement that our mission, regardless of the discipline status of a student, our entire mission is to emphasize the need for the student to be in school. And we will do everything we can not to get kids out of school, but keep them in school. You know, that them being in school is the very best place for them not to get in trouble. And so, you know, when we suspend kids or when they wind up in an alternative program that's a half day, there are unintended consequences from that. So that's my first question is could we almost just right up front say, you know, our mission is for your kids to be in school. You know, should something happen, our work is going to be not only, you know, to get them back in school, but to keep them in school. So that's kind of just a top level question. Specifically on this page, my question is that you say in the second sentence, to the extent, are there testing strips or something? So at the very last line of the page, to the extent the foregoing contains, how do you test for that? Like, I mean, are there
Yeah, most of our SROs have breathalyzers in school, and can test the blood alcohol content through the breathalyzer. Typically, you can smell it on a student
of a
as well.
jewel
Of the jewel or
No, I'm talking about specifically the
Juul.
the vaping device, because if we're saying that the contents of what's in the Juul will determine the discipline outcome, how are we going to figure out what that is?
Great question. So far, the one issue that I had, the student admitted that inside that Juul was THC. Aside from that, I don't know if test kits, right now I'm understanding the test kits the SROs use. So I'm understanding that the SROs test
I mean,
kits
if every
do have
kid
that.
knows that if the contents of the Juul are X, Y, and Z, they're going to be a worse outcome, the answer's always going to be they're always going to cop to the lesser item. So I have a problem that we're saying that we're going to change your discipline outcome based on what's in it, and then it becomes on self-admission, Right. you know, that they get a worse outcome. You see what I'm saying?
Yes, again, typically, the reason it would come to our attention would be the kid was acting in some erratic way if we had some concern about other things. The police will definitely test for THC. So if we have any reason to believe that it's THC, then they will do a test for that. In terms of the alcohol, typically with alcohol offenses, it has been breathalyzers, has been, you know, so they would have to have used it, I guess. You know, the possession of, it doesn't really, whether it's falling into alcohol or it's falling in tobacco, doesn't dramatically change. If it's straight possession, principals still have a discretion in there. It doesn't mandate something.
But we have had situations where some of, it's called honey, and it's where the THC, so if there's THC in the substance, the SROs can test and it will show. So it's not based on their word. It's, and I think that's happened several times. So just asking about what's in it, they can test for that. The alcohol, I don't know about. I think that would just be.
But are you able to test it if the student hasn't been Mirandized?
If we suspect a student
Because now you're
because
testing for something that has a criminal implication.
if the student is under the suspicion of being under the influence of marijuana, or that they have possession of marijuana, let's say it was a bag. Let's say they had a bag of marijuana. The SRO would still test that. I don't know that the procedure is necessarily different. The SRO still tests the marijuana.
But what about the contents of the jewel, which is the rapidly increasing, expanding problem?
Yeah,
I mean, I think that would be the same thing. It would be like, I have a bag and I'm telling you it's oregano. They're going to test it and see whether it's marijuana or
All
not.
right, I'm going
If
to get to the ultimate question that relates to this at the end. Pictures and the law that I did not see as an update. This is a biggie, and this relates to the reference somebody made earlier about what happened in Falls Church City. This issue of sexting and the legal implications that it's still against the law, I think there has to be a massive communications discussion around digital citizenship and pictures of one's or someone else's body and what the implications are. And yes, I think it ought to include values. I think it ought to include the legal implications. I think it ought to include just what that does to another human being, the potential for sex trafficking. I mean, all kinds of things. I just don't think the implications are very severe. And when you look at in other very close school jurisdictions, very young children being charged and, taken into legal custody over the possession of sending a picture of themselves or possessing a picture of somebody else, and then how quickly something like that can go viral, and what the implications are to the long-term emotional well-being of that person. I mean, it's just big. And so I know we're like kind of elevating it, but on my digital citizenship, digital law, digital literacy, I mean, this is way, way up there, because there are serious, we haven't fixed the law side, which I think is a whole different fish, but what are the plans on that?
So what we have right now is actually in this book on page 10. It has a page 10, B1. Sorry, page 12, B1. Yeah, at the top of the page. No, I'm not. Oh, yeah, go to the back of the page. The back. Sorry, Appendix D.
This is in the SR&R, the hard
Yeah,
copy.
it's go into the back to Appendix D. Okay, so B1 talks about vulgar, profane, obscene, patently offensive conduct, including possessing, displaying visual imagery that is obscene as defined under the Code of Conduct, or engaging in indecent, lewd exposure of body parts, including via the internet or other electronic means, is listed under a list of offenses. I mean, it's not getting into the things that you're talking about, but that's where it is and has been referred to in the SR&R. When we do the training for the kids, the videos for the kids, there is explicit commenting about the fact that this has legal consequences. And so, you should, but it doesn't get into the great big picture of digital citizenship.
An outline of a person's body. No pictures from here to here. I mean, just... something simple, like it just has to be clean. I mean, clean and clean. Yeah, I'm just saying I think we have to elevate this conversation a lot, because as I have said, the digital literacy of a child, as that increases, the literacy of the adults around that child decreases. They are in inverse proportion, is that the more savvy the kids become with technology, the less savvy the adults are in impeding stuff. And so it has to be a very intentional conversation, is my point, because there are legal consequences.
And I think it probably has to be a conversation that is bigger than we do as we review SR&R.
I agree. That's my point.
Yeah.
On absences, I have sat in the schools as they review their plans for the year, their school improvement plans, and this really is there are certain communities where there's a value emphasis on either being in school or not being in school. I do think that has to be on the heat map idea. I love it because that identifies where the problem is instead of just applying the same problem everywhere. It applies the problem, more proportionally to where it is. And I do think that there should be a comprehensive communications, plan to mitigate that if that's in the area. But on the flip side, and this is as a parent, and maybe the principals can speak to this, I actually get quite a fair number of absence notices through our automated system. And I talk to whoever is involved with that, and it's almost always a substitute. And he's like, I was there, I was in class, I can't tell you. And so I'm wondering on sort of a false positive, what we do to mitigate that, because I think that there's probably a lot of absences, at least partial, by period, that are noted that, we had our substitute, presentation with 25,000 on Fridays and whatever. I mean, so what do we do to try to get a handle on, is absenteeism as bad as we think it is, or are there a lot of tripping the wire when it's not really?
I'm going to jump in first. The chronic absenteeism is full day, and it's verified full day. So there is a process, part of our calling out when something is unexcused. Like the call out that you get as a parent is sort of a safety thing. If your kid's not in school and you think they're in school, let us know so we can go look for your kid. But in terms of what's recorded in SIS, part of the reason we do those 5-day call-outs when there's so anything that's excused, it means we've already talked to a parent. Somehow they've sent in a note. We've gotten some information about why the child isn't there. If we think a child is absent and we don't have a reason for it, part of the call-out is to say that was an unexcused absence. What was going on?
So
and
what
in
you're
some
saying
cases,
is that the situation that I'm describing doesn't contribute to what we're seeing
it would not
here.
contribute to chronic absenteeism.
All right, well, I'm glad-
and there
okay.
were over 18,000 chronically absent kids last year.
Okay, all right, well, then that's completely something different. I think in Dr. Brabrand, I have said before, our people do not know what a region is. I don't care. You can list a region. You can. People who have multiple children, people who have been parents in the school system for 15 years, they do not know what the region office is. They do not know where to go. I think we have to have an org chart that says, here is what you do. Here is what you do. Here's the path. Your teacher, your principal or assistant principal, and when it has to leave your building, guess what? It's not your board member or the superintendent, or the police.
We'll be glad to work on that. I see the region assistant superintendent numbers or contact, but you're saying a flow chart that helps direct them.
And which schools are under which region? When I say region 4, people say I have no idea what you're talking about.
Okay.
They literally don't. They don't even know the term.
We can work with communications
since
and our folks.
Everybody gets this.
Yeah.
This may
how
be a
to
great
redirect them to our regions to help.
Flow
We'd
chart.
be glad because that's frankly consistent with the communication guidelines that we're bringing you guys in a few weeks. That we want to have parents work with our region folks first. So.
Okay. And the last thing I have is maybe a less than popular, especially with the principals. So, and I'm glad Mrs. Kiesgemar, I was waiting. I waited to bring this up because I think that she might share the same view on this. Where is it explicitly, and I mean extremely explicit, that a student doesn't have to talk? They do not have to talk. They do not have to allow their car to be searched. They do not have to open up their cell phone. I have, and that's why I was asking about the Jewel. I have a tremendous difficulty with a situation where a child could be in very serious trouble. And I'm not talking about the extreme, like active shooting. I'm just talking about they could, by opening their mouth, get themselves in a lot more trouble by simply saying, sure, you can have access to my phone. Sure, you can have access to my car, and the parent hasn't been called. And this is, a couple of us on the board have been like relentless on this. On the first thing that happens is a call needs to go to the parent, and that the kid has to have the right to just shut their fat mouth and not get themselves in more trouble because they're scared. And you know what? They probably should be. I'm not saying that I don't want kids to get in trouble, but I don't want them, because they're legally required to be in a school building and they're a minor, to be in a position where they implicate themselves and turn over lots more evidence and say a lot more things that could get them in a lot more trouble without our emphasizing, look, if you're in trouble, click it and zip it.
I can start with some of that. I think we've come a long way as a school system with trust and having those conversations with kids. I think it's some of the work the school board did 3 years ago around the SR&R has made some of those positive changes. I know from in my school, for instance, we do allow kids to say, listen, I don't feel like talking, and my AP's back off, and we don't really have an issue with that. I think we've done a much better job of notifying parents. I think I would speak for my colleagues, and I would say a kinder, gentler approach to situations with kids that find themselves in the kind of trouble that you're talking about. I think we've come a long way. I think it does come back to rebuilding trust with schools. And it sounds like there might be some conversation about trust here, but I think we've come a long way.
And I would agree with Mr. Jagels. I think maybe we need to make a distinction between someone agreeing to provide a written or a statement and a verbal statement. But I have concerns. I have valid concerns about a student who may be in possession of something that may not be as immediate as a gun. I think we all agree that we would take immediate action to address a situation like that. But especially with the potency of marijuana these days and the concerns around all the different types of marijuana. I mean, pills, et cetera. I mean, I respect the student and the need to protect themselves, and I agree with Dave that I think we've gotten better at parent notification, though I think we still have room for improvement, a growth area perhaps. I do believe that we're reestablishing the trust with our students and with our community. But I have a real concern with allowing a kid to sit idle and not searching the student, not searching the car, not searching a backpack, when in fact there may be other students and even staff who are at risk. And I value the relationships tremendously that I have with students, but at the end of the day, I'm not only responsible for that single student, but in the case of Annandale High School, I'm responsible for more than 2,100 students. And so I think I think if the trust is there and we're using the relationships upon which we can build positive learning environments for kids, we have to understand that at the end of the day, it's not just about protecting the safety and the rights of one student, but it's about protecting the rights and the safety of all the students and the adults in the building. And I think just given certain situations, I don't know that I can say I can really do that if I just if I don't act immediately in some cases.
I just speak from the middle school perspective here a little bit too. At all levels, we really just want kids to be truthful, and then we're gonna work with them. If a kid, each situation is different. If a child's not going to talk, or the parent says to the child, "Look, I don't want you talking," we're not grilling the child. What I tell parents is, I have to make a decision. I have half the facts. I would like to hear your child's side of the facts, and so we can make a decision with all of the facts. I think that's important. But I think going back to Tim's point, we don't ask to search a car, we don't ask to search a backpack unless, in our experience, unless there's concerns. I mean, and including the concerns of, let's say marijuana. Let's say we have a student, and there is a difference between an 18-year-old senior and a 12-year-old 7th grader. And if they're in possession of marijuana, I would argue, or even alcohol for that matter, I would argue that's a safety factor for the child. for that individual child, because if they don't know how they're using or what they're using or the quantity that they're using it, they could put themselves at risk. So for us, it really comes down to a safety issue for that. If a student says another student has a knife, that's a safety issue. We're not randomly checking kids for any reason, because I have 3,000 students. So, I mean, if we're checking 3,000 backpacks, we're not teaching reading, writing, or arithmetic. So that's kind of how we're going for it. But, you know, I can speak for myself, but I think I can speak for also the MSPA on this too. I mean, if it's a security and it's a safety issue.
Let me say, first of all, the recent work that I think the principal associations and the board have done to come together more often, to have conversations sort of in, you know, more relaxed environments has been very helpful. And in the 6 years that I've been on the board, there's been a big change. So, huge progress has been made. And I do think that there was a lot of unhealthy negative tension in the beginning when some of us were pushing really hard for some of these SR&R. But I also want to acknowledge the principals who've come forward and said, you know, we may have dug our heels in the past, but it has been for the good. And so on this particular issue, I get that there are nuances. I get that there's a difference between a knife, you know, and somebody going, you know, this kid's like, you know, he's been threatening. I mean, I am specifically talking about the situations where, you know, kids have been asked to, you know, for the unlock for their phone, or somebody says, well, you know, I think I saw such and such in somebody's car. The potential to increase the amplitude is not at that point about safety. If somebody has something in their car, nobody's unsafe. I mean, if you have the kid and the car's out in the parking lot, you know, things are under control. You can call a parent. And I just worry about those instances, and they're not a lot, but where the consequences are grave for the student. We're talking you're going to wind up being involuntarily transferred, you're going to wind up in a TSRC, you're going to wind up in jail. I mean, there's a lot of things. And while this is about a trust issue, in the end, that parent is the voice for that child. And I'm specifically talking about minors. I'm not talking about anybody who's 18. You're in trouble all on your own once you're 18. I mean, that's the deal. But for anybody under the age of 18, those grievous situations, I want, and a couple other people on the board have been very vocal about, I want that voice of that parent to be a part of that conversation. Exactly what you said, Mr. Graham. You know what? I have half the facts. But that's a conversation that should be had in the presence of the parent, and the parent gets to decide with the child how much more information they're choosing to voluntarily round out, because it's going to go this way or it could potentially go this way, and this way is not great. So I don't know how that gets manifested here, but I'm concerned that we are not reflective enough in this document and in our practices that a student does have the right not to speak, not to turn over their phone, which frankly, that's their life. All the evidence they need to convict them of whatever is on that phone. And if they just hand it over, they've just given away the rights to everything. And getting them to understand their individual rights, their right to privacy in the context of a school that's outside the exigent circumstance is something that I don't think there's been a fulsome conversation on. So I know that other people want to talk, but I do hope that prompts a continued conversation.
Can I just make one more point? And I think it really comes along the lines of illegal substances. Possession's one thing, it's use and possession that really concerns, I think, from a safety perspective, principals. And we've made kind of reference to that several times, where it's not only clear that the kid is in possession, but also under the influence. So there is a point where we need to make a safety decision for that particular child. Are we going to put them on a school bus? Are we going to let them drive their car home? Are we going to, right? So where it is a judgment call because the school day ends, We haven't got a hold of parents. We've tried. We're at that point now where we need to make decisions for that parent. And what does that look like?
How much of your day as a principal is taken up with issues like this, or a week, or I mean, is this a few taking up a lot, or a lot taking up some, or?
It depends on the year, right? I would say it depends on the day, the week. It's seasonal. It comes in waves. Years that you figure that you've done everything you can to combat the issue, you probably have more than you've ever had before. I think I've brought 17 this particular school year, 7 referrals to the division superintendent. Not all of those were substance. Probably 8 of those were substance. So it's not a large portion, but there are significant portions still around substance abuse.
So, and I would say, I feel for the assistant principals, because really that's who the biggest impact is on. If you're looking at, from start to finish, I think so-and-so has marijuana in their bag, or I can smell marijuana in their bag. From start to finish and a packet and all that, basically teacher observations have to be put on hold, because it's, we do have, and rightfully so, a tight timeline then to complete the packets that need to be put in place. So it comes in waves, but for the assistant principals, it can have a huge impact, frankly, on what they do. And none of us got into this business to discipline kids, right? We all got in this business to teach kids. We love teaching and learning. Most of the assistant principals, they will tell you that they spend very, very little of their time actually doing what they truly love, and that is instruction, because they're caught up in some of these other things. So the assistant principals is the biggest impact, I think, that this has on them.
Thank you. Ms. Corbett-Sanders, followed by Ms. Strauss and Mr. Wilson.
Sure, thank you, and I will try to make this brief. I appreciate all you've done here. I do have concerns as far as really parent education and understanding the process and the rights and responsibilities. So I think we need to do a lot more upfront with this. It would be helpful to have either a flow chart in the book, or on our website have something where, it's almost an interactive. Your child's had this challenge, here's where you go, and give a menu then. Your child had that challenge, and here's your menu for that. Or your child, so that it's much more parent engagement up front and being partners in the process. There was a question about the ombudsman. I'm so glad we're going to have the ombudsman. I know the answer ahead of time, but since it didn't get presented here, I'm going to ask it so you can give the answer about an email for the ombudsman.
Right. We will have a generic email, something like ombudsman@fcps.edu. The Chief Academic and Equity Office is working with IT. We'll be working with IT to create that before our manual goes out.
Excellent. And I think it would be helpful to have that little button on every school website, so that people have a better understanding of how to get to the ombudsman. Similarly, with the regional assistant superintendent, a little button on each of our local sites, so that once again, instead of people searching for it, that they can more easily access the resources available to them. But there also should be some sort of commitment that they will get a response within a fixed period of time. I think that's critical, that if somebody reaches out in the same way that, our constituents expect us to respond to queries, that we give an expectation to our parents that when they reach out for assistance, they will be responded to within a period of time. The other thing is that I think it would be helpful when we talk about the impact of actions taken by students, that we make it very clear that in our SR&R that recess will not be taken away from our elementary school students unless there's a specific, educational reason for it, because we have a new reg that does that, but we don't necessarily have that reflected in here.
You go ahead.
We'll have to talk about that, I think, as a leadership team. That information is going into 2 different regulations, not specifically this one, but we can have some conversation as a leadership team about that and talk to division council about it.
Well, I would like some sort of, as a next step then, a clarification back to us about recess, because it's something that is near and dear to children's hearts, to their parents' hearts, and it's something that has we've done a lot of work on, so we want to make sure we address that.
We actually, I know, because we did this in leadership team, we have language. It's just about whether the language that we're putting in one place can be placed in the SR&R to have the similar language throughout. So it's
that consistency and messaging, I think, is really important, and that's what brings me to the penultimate recess, graduation. And 30 days from graduation, having certain restrictions that if you get into trouble, you can't graduate, you can't participate. We all know about that time of year. But I don't see it specifically in here. I know we reach out to our parents or to our seniors about it, but I think we need to clearly state it in our SR&R what our policy is on that. So I would suggest we need to address that. And then last but not least, I would like to see at some point us really actually 2 more things, I'm sorry. Peer courts. So peer, many school systems actually have, especially their middle and high school students, and some of our own schools have a peer council that addresses discipline issues and infractions, and so it's the ultimate diversion first. And so if we can, I don't know where you all are on this, but I would like us to be thinking about that more as a consistent delivery.
I think there are some schools that definitely have honor councils. A lot of that's related to cheating. I personally, and I'll let the principal speak to this, have some concerns about our level of confidentiality when it comes to discipline incidents and sharing that information with other students, but the principals could.
Yeah, again, I think there's certain rights to privacy that students need to have, and my fear with an honor council, especially related to discipline, might compromise some of that work.
Well, it's being done elsewhere in the country, and so I think it would be worth doing an exploration, not this year, obviously, but going forward, because, certainly you can build in some confidentiality, you can build in safeguards, but if it is a way of addressing concerns, especially in the area of, like, bullying at the school level, it's always healthier, I think.
Yeah, we'll look into that. Actually, 25 years ago at Herndon High School, we had a peer counseling program that was almost like a diversion first piece that didn't get into the specific details. It was sort of a broad referral, and then the administrator could decide it's appropriate which ones could go off to the kids. So we'll take a look at that, and as we keep looking at ways to try to, again, redirect kids out of the discipline track and into the restorative justice, or really understanding how their behavior impacts on their peers and the rest of the classrooms.
And then my last question is on dress code. Dress code gets people in trouble all the time. And the last sentence of the first paragraph in C on page 4 says, a principal may provide additional examples of his or her community. That's a little worrisome. And so I would like to better understand why we don't have a consistent dress code policy from building to building, and rather that seems a little subjective.
So I'll give you an example of something that we're wrestling with specifically at our school, and that is head coverings. And culturally, some cultures, head coverings, complete head coverings, is part of that culture. And we have mostly young ladies who will spend a significant amount of time covering it, but by the letter of the law, the SRNR, it is completely covering the head, and so it is not. I'm not talking about religious wear. I'm talking about other types of wear, and that creates a lot of tension sometimes for us, because the teachers also want that. The teachers will also say, "Well, is this a head covering? Is this not a head covering?" And I think that in an effort to be uniform, we do try to define those. I also think, and I'll be frank with you, I depends on what battles I want to have with the kid in the hallway too. So hats and hoods and some of those are for us are safety issues. If you have a hoodie on and I can't see your face, I don't know who you are. That's a safety issue. That is truly becomes a safety issue. Is it a partial covering of the hair? Is there loose hair out from underneath it? Is it a complete covering of the hair? So that's where we try to, and each school I'm sure does the same thing. We try to define that. We do try to define that for our students. But we do have students who will push back and say, well, this is part of my culture from whatever country I'm from. I can't argue that that's not part of their culture. So it does, we are in a little bit of conundrum with that.
So you actually make the argument that I was trying to make, which was that you shouldn't be in the business of determining what is acceptable from a culture and what isn't, because I know I come to every event or every experience with certain biases that make up who I am. And so I don't want to put our teachers and our principals in the same situation where they're looking at it from a certain lens, and their lens may not be in alignment with the lens of an individual's culture. So the more clarity we can have in our guidance, and a less reliance on a building by building interpretation, I think the better. And that's why I'm a little concerned when we have something that says that it is a building by building decision on that.
I think to provide that guidance will take quite a bit of study, and not something we can probably do between now and June when this has to be done. If we're going to come up with a universal across, because just in terms of the principals are going to be more sensitive at this point to what various cultures they have in their building than I as a central person will be. We're going to have to get a team together and look at it and different levels and look at, the dress code overall and see whether there's some additional guidance that could be provided, I would think.
I think it would be helpful, especially in today's world, to have a consistent guidance rather than it being interpretive. And so if I could have that as one of my next steps. Do I need to go through what I said to get all of the next steps, or we? Okay. Great. Thank you very much.
All right, Ms.
The 30-day question. Oops. I'm sorry. What page was it on? I have my expert here looking next to me. Page 14. Thank you. So what the SRNR currently says is for high school students, the first violation of this subsection, which is about alcohol inhalants, non-alcoholic beer, and other substances. It says the first violation of this subsection shall also result in a suspension from school for 30 calendar days, a suspension for 30 calendar days from all student activities, including teams, clubs, and any other school-sponsored activities, is what it says currently.
And then when it happens, people go, well, what do you mean? That's not a school-sponsored activity. That is a rite of passage for the child and his or her family, and that's graduation. So I am very concerned that we either have to make it clear that it doesn't have an impact on a child's ability to walk across the stage, or it does. It needs to be, and that is got to be explicit so there are no surprises and people go in eyes wide open.
So I get your idea there. Like we were just doing on the earlier thing this morning, I can't even remember what it was. It was the FLECAC, actually, and it was such as trusted adults, and then we back and forth about whether to enumerate. You would want enumeration of other school-sponsored activities such as homecoming, prom, graduation exercises. Okay.
All right, are you done, Ms. Sanders? Yes. All right. Ms. Strauss, followed by Mr. Wilson.
Okay, just a couple of quick things on page 18, 19, and 20, which is the chart, which was added some years ago, which is great, that shows consequences for students, offenses, or violations. This is extremely helpful. I don't remember when we added it. And I guess the question C, which always shows under Virginia Code, what has to be sent to the hearings office. Have there been any changes as a result of anything that's gone through the General Assembly, or does that hold?
Nothing that's gone through this year, no.
Okay.
And we review it each year, and we review it in partnership with the hearings office, but there's not been a change this year that would impact those.
Right, okay. This is very helpful. Briefly, the sort of searching a car, et cetera. If there is reasonable suspicion that there is an illegal substance or a weapon, even if you are stopped at a traffic stop in traffic, they can search your car, they can ask to, and if you say no, they'll bring the dogs. So if there is reasonable suspicion, and it has to be reasonable suspicion. It's either you smell it or you were under the influence. They can ask to search, and they can effectuate that. So, as you say, the issue of safety for children, we obviously can't do that if there's no reason to do it. But if there is real reason to do that, it has always been our modus operandi to do that for the safety of everybody. So, and obviously call the parents and do all the rest of it. The kid does not have to write a statement or any of that. But I don't think under the law, I think that we are operating within the law in protecting the safety of the children and the rest of the building, correct? That's right.
So, we don't, we only search a car if there is reasonable suspicion.
Exactly. There has to be reasonable suspicion.
Because otherwise we don't have a right to do it. Plus, we don't want to necessarily go through that.
No.
So I can tell you that in 15 years of searching cars, we have only searched cars when we had some real, either the kid smelled of it or 3 students said, yes, Johnny sold it to me, and it's in the right back seat of the car. We have some very, very strong, and those are the only times we do. And then the other piece is the kid driving.
Exactly.
That's, we don't want a kid driving under the influence either. So those are the only times.
Yeah, I would ask about the telephone because there was a Supreme Court case on and dealing with adults arrested, and kind of where that stands for kids with phones and schools, and kind of where are we? Because that was a very interesting Supreme Court case, and it basically held that you did not have to open a cell phone unless it had immediate bearing on exactly the evidence that the police were looking for. So how do we interpret that if we're in a hearing situation and there is evidence? What do we do? How do we do that?
Well, from a school perspective, I haven't looked at a phone in probably over 5 years.
Right.
Yeah. So typically, if something of that nature goes directly to the SRNR, the SRO,
Okay.
who would do that. But again, I've personally, and we've been told this, directly.
That's what I would assume.
Not
that's
to look
not,
at cell
no,
phones.
you can't casually
Correct.
do that. Again,
Correct.
there has to be tremendous suspicion at
Correct.
that point in order to open a phone. That was my reading of the Supreme Court case. Not if we have other lawyers here, but that's my understanding. So you can't casually ask a kid to open their phone. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Wilson, followed by Mr. Moon, and then Ms. McLaughlin.
Thank you, Ms. Derenak, Kofax. I have one specific question on slide 11. This new language, it just strikes me as that we may. I'm concerned about how it's going to be enforced. So, the reference to being an expectation of being a good citizen, good citizenship at all times.
This is just a statement.
Okay.
And the way the within the SR&R, the way things are organized is it sort of organizes things that are offenses and then says these things are things that the principal has discretion over, up to 5 days suspension. This is a statement that we really were putting in there in part at the request of some members of the school board who said that they felt because this was a document that parents read, it should be in there. So what we were really saying was the consequences or the important pieces sort of default to the use policy. And this was just to let you know that, there may be situations where your use of a cell phone or some other device, even when it's not on school grounds, could have this nexus with school, in which case we would have an involvement.
So maybe the last sentence, maybe that could be clarified. It says, depending on specific circumstances, failing to adhere to these standards can lead to consequences under the SR. What are you talking about then?
So again, if what I think the example given was that if, for example, over the communication, it says, I will meet you in the school bathroom and beat you up, that would be a clear case where there was a nexus to school. Often what also occurs, and I see this more at the middle school level than almost anywhere, is that there is conflict between kids that's been going back and forth by social media, and then the kids see each other in the hallway, and there's a confrontation of some sort.
So just stepping off from that example. So let's say that those kids don't say, I'll meet you in the bathroom, I'm going to kick your butt. They say, I'm going to do it the next time I see you in front of my house. I mean, it's still a threat of violence. Does that mean that that's not going to end up being a cause for concern if that's brought
not
to the
unless we see something at school, no.
So a threat of violence would not ever rise to that level?
Again, threats of violence, and that's why we left it broad. So a threat of violence against somebody at the school itself, et cetera.
Outside of school.
Excuse me?
Outside of school. Threat of violence between
students. Typically what we would do is call the parents and let them know that there had been a threat. We might do a threat assessment. There's several things that we might do, but it's not sort of a disciplinary response, if you will. Again, unless, in some cases it rises to a level that the police are involved. I mean, because there is such a range of these things, without somehow implying that the school is going to get involved in everything, but also allowing that the schools may have to get involved in some things. We were just looking for general language that could kind of capture that, because I just don't think you can spell out, in this case we will, in this case we won't, in this case we will, in this case we won't.
Yeah, and maybe that is sort of a situation you don't know until you get it as to whether or not it's an appropriate response.
I mean, certainly, from my other hat, from the psychology, social work, counseling side of things, things come to our attention that are not directly, something that we are necessarily going to contemplate with a discipline thing, but there would be an intervention. We might do a threat assessment. I know of situations where we have utilized restorative justice between two kids are just, at each other and their families are at each other, not as a disciplinary thing, but to try to resolve that conflict before it gets into something that is going to be a fight or, some issue at school.
So in this paragraph, then, it doesn't make clear that it has to relate specifically to the school day. Is that an intentional?
Yes,
it just says,
because
depending on the circumstance, failing to adhere. So if you're determined to be not displaying good citizenship, if I'm a student or parent reading this, I might be like, well, what does that really mean? They're going to be, if something that I use on Snapchat gets forwarded back to the school, or is my kid going to be in trouble?
Right. Again, part of what we were trying to say was that when you get into the world of social media, it is the things we do beyond the words that we put in the SR&R that really are going to address some of the concerns you were talking about before, sexting and various things. I agree that it's very broad. There was some debate about putting it in at all, but there seemed to be a desire to have some statement that would let parents know that there could be consequences under the SR&R.
Mr. Wilson, it might help on this. The whole issue here is we have an expectation of what we want to see with students' good use of social media. The legal issue is whether there's a nexus between what happens on social media and the school. And sometimes that's not even clear until from the weekend, whether it comes to school or not. If it stays outside and happens outside, it's not in our purview. If it stays outside and then comes in, something from the weekend comes in on Monday, then there is a nexus. And the court determines the nexus based on the facts of the case. So it is, there's been appellate court cases. I don't know if it's made it to the Supreme Court case yet, defining what level of nexus is a nexus between the school and community. So I think the spirit of this here is to try to say we have an expectation for kids to have good social media behavior and citizenship all the time, everywhere. Then based on specific circumstances, of which there are so many, it would be like a 50-layer chart, of which some of that, ultimately, if there's a nexus established with the school, you can find yourself in violation of the SR&R. Some other board members said, I think we've got to keep doing a better job of actually helping parents and the kids understand this community school connection. Oh, I'm in the community, it's nothing. What I do on Saturday night is just whatever. Not really, because more likely than not, more of this stuff finds its way into school than doesn't. And so I think some of this is less SR&R and more our own communication with kids and parents in our community by our principals.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. I guess I would hope that principals generally, if it includes some violent behavior towards others, some sort of self-harm, engaging in illegal activity that they're demonstrating, they've got their jewel and they're doing a live stream or something and it gets clipped and sent. We're letting parents know what's happening if this being, even if we decide, hey, we're not going to enforce it. I think we've got to take an action so that in some cases, for the safety of those kids and so that parents can engage with their children on an issue that maybe comes to our attention.
One other thing, Mr. Wilson, board, and I know we have many things to go through, but just to help. There is social media discussions that are inappropriate happening all the time. After Florida, the tragedy that it was, you know what happened here? Kids finally started bringing forward to school administrators stuff that's been happening offline that we have no clue about. And that's why we had all those social threats going in our middle and high schools, because our kids came forward. But it's happening. You want to, whatever you want to call it, the dark internet or the dark social media. The kids have been doing it. After Florida, they said, we need to let a trusted adult know something. And that's why they came forward. And then there was a nexus to school. I'm not coming to school. I'm scared. They started paying attention to their own inappropriate behavior. This paragraph is about trying to set expectations of what we want our students to do at all times, anywhere. Depending on how all that plays is whether it ultimately becomes a nexus back to the school.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Moon, followed by Ms. McLaughlin and then Ms. Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Fairfax. Since we don't often have three of the best high school principals in the same room like this with the board members, I'm going to take this opportunity to ask some questions. That you've been with FCPS for how long? 20 years probably, 25, 15. Good. We can go back to maybe 25 years and start from there. But the last few years, based upon the data provided to board members, the number of cases referred to hearings have been increasing. For example, back in 2014-15, it was 521, and last year it was 660. And this year, it is projected to be about 825. Could you tell us, is that what you see from your schools? And each one of you, could you comment on the reasons behind the increase? And the next question is, those are the cases being referred to hearings offices, but overall behaviors. You think overall behaviors is reflected, basically trend in the behavior is reflected in the number of cases being referred to the hearings offices. And if that's the case, is there anything that we are doing wrong, anything that we should we could do better, or we're just in a hopeless situation?
It's never hopeless.
26-year-old, I'll take that. Well, I think, first of all, I'd like to see the breakdown on the number of referrals by grade level or by elementary, middle, and high, because I don't know that number, and I don't know whether the increase in the number of
And I'm
referrals.
only asking for your scores, whether it's Annandale or Westfield, your experience.
Okay. Yeah, my experience in Annandale over the last 3 years has been pretty steady. Most of the referrals that come to the hearings office are related to marijuana possession or use, few related to distribution. At Annandale, there are a number of referrals that we've brought to the hearings office related to crimes in the community, which could include drug distribution, assault, the charges that are reportable to the school board. So I don't know that, and this is purely anecdotal, but I don't know that the kids, and this is not a knock on the changes either. In fact, I'm probably one of the gritty old veterans that dug their heels in and said, no, this is going to backfire on us. But and I've welcomed the changes in having some of the kids back in schools, for example, that might have not been allowed to return previously. And as much as we dug in around the parent notification piece, I think it's been embraced, and it's helped to shift mindsets. That being said, I think what we see is reflective of the overall increase in and I don't know if the data with the survey reflects this or not, but I'd be curious to know if there's an overall increase in drug use and possession among our high school students or among students at Annandale High School. I have that data, and I'll look at it. Admittedly, I have not. Shame on me. But kids are a bit more brazen now, I feel like. Maybe they know word gets out that if you get caught, you'll be back in many cases. The fact that I think the expedited review is a wonderful tool at our disposal. I wonder if kids go through an expedited review and then feel less of a consequence, and word gets out, and that helps too. And those are wonders for me. I don't know those for sure. Going back to social media and the use of phones, folks, I can't even explain to anyone in this room the impact that it's had on our jobs as I wouldn't even know how to begin to explain what it's like now versus what it was like 10 to 15 years ago. I can't even explain it. It has changed our kids' lives. It has changed our teachers' lives. It has changed our parents' lives. It has changed our lives dramatically, and not for the better. And you're talking to someone who raised 4 teenagers. So I get it, but I don't know, Mr. Moon, to your point, I don't know that it's easy to pinpoint one thing in particular when the changes in our students' behavior is actually, in my opinion, it can be attributed to societal changes, political changes, communication changes, cultural changes, and so I'd like to think that the changes we've made have been very beneficial and positive, and has increased our understanding about the need to better care for our students and better communicate with our kids and our families. But there are so many other factors at play that it's really difficult for me to draw that conclusion, to be honest. Sorry.
So, Mr. Thomas, so what do we do?
Well,
you are an educator. We set policies.
Yeah.
So help us out.
We need to get kids in school. I cannot agree more. And when I addressed this board a couple of months ago, and we spoke about the impact on the mobility rate in our schools, I was asked the question, if I could have anything, what would it be? And I said, we need an answer for attendance. We need our kids in schools. And listen, it's not just on our kids and our families, but it's the challenge is also for us as educators to to create classrooms and school climates that are more engaging and where we can demonstrate a genuine care and concern for our kids. And you know, I think we need more work around attendance, and I think we need, especially as the school division continues to change, we can't ignore the need for increased parent liaisons and ways to communicate with families, social workers, counselors. You know, if you ask me, that's where it is. And I think continuing to push to me, the single most valuable component of school operations is what happens in the classroom. And as we can, you know, we have to continue to hire high quality people and get rid of those that are not. Thank you.
So, you know, for me, it's been interesting to see a lot of behaviors that we used to associate with maybe college-age students we've seen move to the high school. In my last 4 years, and Gordon's here and he can speak to a longer view of the middle school, the number of high school-type behaviors that we now see in 7th and 8th graders has been a big shift. And so being able to see that and working through that. I'd also say I think several years ago, you know, Dana said, hey, you know, you haven't had a marijuana case, and it was like March, and thank you, Dana, the next day we had a marijuana case. So that year we didn't have very much. I would say we have a lot of it this year. I don't know what it is, but it seems to be more prevalent. I do feel like that the social media has really negatively impacted. One of our themes this year has been about empathy. I think, honestly, we have less empathetic kids. And a lot of our discipline comes from simply not being able to relate to the other kid or the other situation. So I think anything that we can do and go back to almost intentionally teaching social skills, for lack of a better word, because our kids, they struggle. And so that social media thing, man, we're talking big stuff on the weekend. Now we're looking at each other. They don't know what to do. And the resiliency and the being able to negotiate through. I'll give a big shout out to our SOSAs. At the high school level, I would say the middle school level, the SOSA would be an incredible position. So I'm in that position where I have 7 through 12, and I'm very big into vertical articulation. My SOSA probably spends 60% of her time on the middle school level, not on the high school level. Some huge percentage of my discipline, probably about 85% of my discipline, is in the 8th and the 9th grade. If I take my 8th and 9th graders out, I have hardly any discipline. My 7th graders are still too scared to do anything wrong, you know, and then my sophomores, my juniors, and my seniors are kind of over it. It's that 8th and 9th grade level. So, then I would say that those would be the biggest things that I see. I don't think kids want to be mean to each other necessarily. I think kids have always been a little bit mean to each other, but I think most of our kids, the vast majority of kids, they want to get along and they want to fit in. They don't know how. And then when they get into a conflict, they don't know how to walk away from the conflict. So those would be the areas that I would see.
I would echo my colleagues. Yeah, Dr. Dalton, we heard him speak at high school or all county principals 3 weeks ago. The iPhone was introduced in 2007, and they saw a 37% increase in depression soon thereafter. And, you know, I think we're writing a social experiment now that we don't know what the outcome is. I'm not completely blaming it on technology, but I think kids, I think it goes back to some of the social cues, you know, reading each other and knowing how to respond. I echo the sentiments of the political climate being divisive and the intolerance that we seem to have for each other. In a confined space like a school system or a school building, you know, where you may say things on the weekend and then come back together and not really know how to confront that. When I look at all my markers from the teen youth survey, my stress is down, my depression's down, my alcohol and substance abuse is down. So those are great things, but I'm still bringing kids to the hearings office for substance abuse. And so, you know, I echo Mr. Thomas, and it would be great to have community schools, meaning schools that it's invaluable not to be there. So if we look at a model where everything a student might need, if we look at our ELLs and talk about health and dental and vision, social emotional issues, all of those things could be met at schools. Now all of a sudden schools are invaluable I can't afford to miss school because I'm not only getting my education by my services there as well. You know, in the 28 area, Route 28, public transportation is a mess. You can't get there from here. And so if you start looking at issues related to social emotional well-being of kids, which I think a lot of those social emotional issues tend to create behavior problems in schools, or have the tendency to create behavior problems in schools, meeting those needs is difficult. I don't know if I answered your question.
Thank you so much. Yeah. I think we should invite you back more often to our school board work sessions. I don't know why Mr. Thomas is giggling, but thank you for accepting the invitation.
And if I could just share a few other comments. I think the pervasiveness of the technology and in fact, there was an article shared in our MSPA this morning about just the cognitive ability for kids to be able to put this thing away at night. It's difficult for students. It's difficult for us sometimes. But that's certainly a huge factor in some of the different disciplines, some of the behaviors we're seeing. I would agree with Martin in the brazen. I think a lot of the discipline that we're seeing also at middle school is that what we call defiance. We have a teacher trying to establish, a positive attitude in the classroom, positive atmosphere, and you have the student, and typically these can be your repeat offenders in this category. I'm not going to follow through with those basic expectations in the classroom. And you have teachers, administrators working to really try to help a student understand the impact of that behavior. And you can spend a lot of time on that repeated behavior. It might not rise to the hearings office, but it's occupying a tremendous amount of time with our assistant principals, and working through a variety of different positive strategies, behavior plans, check in, check out, restorative justice, which I think we've tried to use a lot more to positive effect. But I think there's a lot of work being done, knowing that we don't want kids out of school. We want them in the building, but there still has to be those basic expectations in the classroom so you can have that positive learning environment. So we're spending a lot of time there, and I think it's a very interesting conversation to see how it's reflected from 7th through 12th.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Ms. McLaughlin, followed by Ms. Evans.
Okay. First of all, I'm just going to first pick up on something that was said about community schools. I was just at the national conference with Dr. Marianne Panarelli and several FCPS staff and county staff over on the government side. Amazing, and absolutely speaks to what you're describing when you have wraparound services, and we're looking at the tremendous need, including things like depression and mental health issues. Having social services in the buildings makes it so that we're communicating to the students and our families that we are in a shared mindset of it takes a village to raise a child. And that is where we are in Fairfax County, especially when 1 in 3 kids are now dealing with poverty. So that's very real. A couple of things that have been touched on so far. Dr. Brabrand, you've heard me talk about this. Dr. Lockhart's heard it even more. Ms. Corbett-Sanders, thank you for bringing it up. I feel very passionately that we should not be taking away the ability for a student to participate in graduation services unless it's a serious offense. We certainly want our students to stay safe, but each year what we've found too often is that the one reason they're not walking at graduation is because they got caught with alcohol infraction during prom. And some principals have said, well, I want that carrot and stick still there. And yet, just last year when Woodson held its prom outside of the 30 days, they still did not have alcohol infraction. So this notion that we need it to be within the 30 days in order to keep kids from, imbibing, I don't necessarily think it's causal, but I do think we need to think about, this is known as not one of our more serious offenses, but when it's within that 30 days, we are taking away a lifetime event for not just the child, but for the parents. And I think we have to think very carefully, and I would like to see by the next SR&R, and I'm going to put up as a next step, that we really think about that. I'd still like to see, even if we could consider before we vote on this as a board, why can't we have it as a case-by-case basis that, the principals, again, can, defer it, either make the decision. I think like our principals know our families and our kids, and it just really worries me that we go a lot on anecdote or personal perspective, and we're just hurting kids and families in the process. The second thing is that in terms of what we're doing with restorative justice, I so appreciate Principal Thomas, you in particular, really speaking from your personal mindset when I joined the board in January of 2012, and many of us came to the board with this passion to have more restorative discipline practices. And Ms. Evans, you were a champion for parent notification. I've been a champion on the second chance for first possession marijuana cases. Just your willingness to share that you're willing to see and broaden your thinking is giving me, Dr. Brabrand, this emphasis again that on my next step, I'm going to really ask, just right across the boundary at Arlington Public Schools, they've had now since 2010 a very active second chance program for first possession marijuana cases. And we're not just saying first possession or first use, we're talking anything that's a Virginia Class 1 misdemeanor. And that could be simple possession, but also possession with intent to distribute up to 14 grams. That's all a Class 1 misdemeanor. No one wants marijuana in our schools at all. But when Arlington has so much success in the fact that those kids go through that diversion program via the court system or by the public school system, they go through that second chance program, they're not repeat offending. And so the question is, do you need to take a hammer to a kid's head, or do you need to tap them on the head? And I would just like our system to, and I really would want to make sure that Ms. Teresa Johnson's hearing me on this one. I just want our system to be open-minded on this and go talk to Pat Murphy, the superintendent over there, to go talk with him and hear about the successes of their program. For too long, Fairfax County has said, this is how it's going to be. And I would just like for us to, again, provide even for our principals, who you've been educators in your building, but hopefully what you gain from central administration is that they're going out and looking at jurisdictions, especially right next door, and saying, maybe here's a better practice we could think about. Bob Birmingham is our director of the juvenile court system. Bob is very much a believer and a supporter of second chance. When I went down to the Classrooms, Not Courtrooms conference, a Virginia conference, and we had numerous judges there, Judge Gail Carr, also a Fairfax County parent. They're all asking me, what is our resistance to the second chance program? So it wasn't something that, quite frankly, former Superintendent Karen Garza liked. It wasn't her thing, and we weren't going anywhere with it. And so it is my plea, because Dr. Brabrand, you made such great strides in Lynchburg. I know and observed you at the VSBA. It's an area you care about, and I'd just like to see us continue to make some really great progress in our commitment here. I think we're all in agreement we do better when kids stay in school. We also do better when, and we know the psychology, students do better when they stay in their school and their community. So no one wants unsafe schools, but we know when we remove them and send them elsewhere, it has a psychological harmful effect. So, that's my big push while we're sitting here in our annual review. To Mr. Moon's point about the hearings office cases, and I'm glad that Ms. Scanlon's here, because I say this a lot. Work-life balance is critically important. And as one board member, and I believe all my colleagues feel the same, we don't want you overburdened with your caseload and your workloads. It means that not only does it impact your health and well-being, but it probably makes it more difficult to best serve our families. But that said, this board needs to have a future work session where we review the data. Making decisions absence of data is very harmful. So we need to see what are the increase in these cases going from 520 to 660 to 825? What are the infractions? We can't possibly here today start to say what's happening without actually just looking at the data. And God bless Mary Left-Gloveglass and her team, but they can run data upward, forwards, backwards, upside down. We can get it. And I really think that it's what we need to be doing. So I just want to finally say that to Teresa Johnson and your team, it's so appreciated that the work you're doing to bring out to the schools. Stefan, I know you and I were at that conference together. You have also been a champion of how do we really continue to embrace restorative justice. And so, again, I'm just one of those board members that says, please let's keep going in that really positive direction. And to our principals, I want you to know your voice always matters. And if we can help bring information to help you think broadly, but also for you then to reflect on it and then tell us where your concerns are, we really do, as Ms. Schultz and others have said, value a partnership with you very much. But we have a responsibility. When Mr. Moon says we set policy, we should be setting policy on research and best practice that then helps lead the superintendent and all of you in the work you're doing. So thanks for coming here today and being with all of us. It's appreciated.
Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
First of all, I do want to thank everybody for coming. I apologize for missing the very beginning of this due to my other job. And I appreciate especially the folks represented here from our schools. This is just really, it just feels, it's music to my ears. I try to do this in my visits to be able to hear what folks are saying. But I really would look forward to some kind of brainstorming, Dr. Brabrand, where we can have this kind of interaction so that it really is a way of informing how we make our decisions and how we make recommendations. Since I've stepped on this board, I've been extremely concerned about how we handle discipline and the number of cases that we have and how sometimes it looks like one thing is happening depending on where it is or which principle. Consistency is a concern. And so just in the interest of trying to achieve some of those, I would welcome an opportunity to talk to you guys more and others like you because it really, I have to say, if there's anything that keeps me up at night and causes me to keep my husband up at night is just these kinds of issues. So I'm going to go through some of those concerns. I'd like to ask you guys how you feel you have been trained. Do you have the tools that you need to really be able to deal with some of these cases, the discipline cases that are coming to you, or you feel like you kind of winging it, or are you just calling the person down the street with a similar situation? I mean, one of the things that I'm concerned about is making sure that we are providing the kinds of support that you guys need to be able to do this job well.
I'm going to start by saying this document really helps us because it really is what keeps us consistent from school to school. So having this with fidelity really helps us make our decisions. So taking the time to make sure that things are said the way we want it to say, and I credit the folks up here as well for doing the drafting. But your input's important. But we use this as our guide to help make decisions. I credit Ms. Scanlon in the back as well for updates every year about what's happening from a legal perspective, locally and nationally, in terms of the kind of pitfalls that could get school personnel in trouble in regards to certain legal issues that relate to this or issues that relate to this.
So do you feel like you've been able to really implement restorative justice, or is that something in process?
I'm a huge fan of restorative justice. I'd like to say I'm a founding father of restorative justice.
Oh, good.
So, yeah, early adopter. But yeah, I think it's one of those things where we need to continue to make sure that we have the personnel that can support the schools. Because it's for 5 people to manage the numbers of schools that they have is quite a huge task. So the schools want to use restorative justice, but if we hear, we don't hear this, but managing the number of cases that they have, it might be a day or two before they can get into the schools. But having personnel that be able to immediately respond to those needs and those requests.
I guess I'm misunderstanding. My understanding that you have people, or at least some schools have people within their schools.
People within
that
the school
handle
are trained.
it.
Sometimes it helps to have someone that's a neutral party.
Okay.
That not necessarily tied to the school. Just depends. But yes, the process is to get folks in the building trained to be able to implement the restorative justice.
So they've got me into restorative justice. So I'm an early adopter, just not a pioneer. And I think it has been very helpful. But going back to the consistency piece too, I do think having the people from outside who don't have an emotional, investment in the students helps a lot with the restorative justice. I think the piece with the consistency sometimes is difficult. So I'll give you a perfect situation. Kid A and Kid B get in a fight, and Kid A gets a 3-day suspension and Kid B gets a 5-day suspension. So why is that? That doesn't sound right. Kid A, it's the first time he's been in trouble. He got in a fight. It was a fight. It was an ugly fight in the middle of the cafeteria. It was a huge school disruption. Kid B, it's his 4th fight this year. And so that's sometimes when folks will say, well, why does it look, on the surface it can look uneven because there's not the background there. The other piece of it, though, goes back to, we've been talking about and going back to the SOSA piece, is getting back to the root problem. The defiance piece, I'm telling you, defiance is a big deal, and what is happening is it's affecting 29 other kids in the classroom. When that kid stands up and says, I'm not going to put my phone away, what are you going to do about it? That in the big picture is not going to show up in the hearings office or anything like that, but that undermines the teacher's authority. It puts a teacher, we talk about teacher morale and the engagement survey. I mean, for a teacher, it's very demoralizing. Even when we discipline the student, when the student comes back and then does it again, sometimes they'll feel like the teacher will say, well, you didn't do anything. Well, actually, we did do something, but it wasn't. So I think going back to those root causes, I think, being the proactive piece and being able to get to the root causes. Again, it's not a bunch of our kids. Mm-hmm. It's a small group of our kids. And so why are these kids continue to have these concerns? And I think we have to dig a little bit deeper than, you suspend my kid, you'll suspend him once. And trust me, you'll suspend them one time. So I don't think kids want to be suspended. So why are we continuing to be into that boat? So I think going back to the root cause is important.
Well, and you don't have to answer this now, but I guess is how do we get to that? And how do we make sure we have tools to make sure we can get back to the root causes? I think a lot of our discussions are surrounding that. I know I, like a number of my colleagues, were a bit surprised to see a budget request for an additional hearings officer, not because we don't think it should happen, but because we hadn't received information prior to that time to explain why we needed that. So, and it is concerning to us to see this upward trend when we have been working so hard to reduce discipline cases. And I can say, from being on the board, we are getting that information, whether a kid has been, whether this is his 3rd fight or whether it's his 1st fight. So when I talk about consistency, I'm not talking about those to the public, perhaps. But that's an overall concern we can look at. I support Ms. McLaughlin's suggestion. I would love to see what some other jurisdictions are doing to try to reduce their cases. I think anything is pretty much worth a try at this point, because we just can't continue to go up and up. I don't think that our population increase justifies these number of increases in cases. I'd like to try to identify what some of the hindrances are to restorative justice. I believe you guys that you have implemented it, but I think perhaps that's not necessarily the case across the county. And so I'd like to figure out how we can possibly, as a next step, try to figure out how that's happening and where that's happening. Mr. Wilson mentioned something about social media, and it's still up there. I'm not sure. I know we talk to our kids about the use of social media. I still get the sense in working with kids that they don't understand the weight of their actions when they are shooting off that text or making that comment. And so I'd like to see what more we can do to try to improve that understanding. I think I heard somebody over here say something, even if we can have little vignettes or videos or anything so that parents can have these discussions with their kids. I think that's really important because the fact of the matter is they assume they know until they find out they don't know. And it may be our job to help them to figure out the stuff that they don't know as well.
That additional information that I know board members asked for, it got approved today by me in the middle of all of this, and we should have that out to you tomorrow with the information behind the increase in the hearings office.
I'm sure people have heard that we had a reaction, and I just wanted to state as to why I personally had a reaction to those numbers, hearing about those numbers at that particular point. We certainly want to support our staff members and get them what they need, but at the same time, okay, you're looking at me like I need to stop talking. No. Okay, all right.
No, I just wanted to let board members in the community know that information, you should have it available tomorrow.
Okay.
Well in advance of any decisions you need to make.
Okay. Somebody mentioned about head coverings beyond the hijab. Yeah, can you tell me what you're talking about?
It's coming from most of our female students who have West African heritage.
Oh, okay.
And it's the very colorful, but it's a full cover. So versus, a little bit of a hairband, which typically for girls we've allowed to hold the hair back, right? I don't have any of those problems. Right. You probably didn't notice, but it's
just a demonstration,
right? It's well, you should see me try to straighten my daughter's hair for her picture, but it's that piece of it, and so as we enforce that, it is a little bit of, and it's the gray area, and there's always going to be gray. This book can never provide all the answers for us, and we really don't want to be hemmed into such specific language that there's no room. But that would have been, that's just an example, though, of where you're going to have to use judgment. And so in one school where I may allow some of that because I feel like I'm serving my community, another school who has a different situation, but they're not allowing the full head cover, that's going to feel inconsistent. And I could, from a global standpoint, I can see where there's some frustration in that. But yet at the local level would make a whole lot of sense for both of those schools to be somewhat inconsistent. So that's, I guess, was the only point I was trying to make.
So would it be helpful, for example, to have kind of local rules available to parents so that they can understand, these are things, the trends that we're seeing, and making sure that everybody else is aware of that. But, I can imagine that some of these things would be regional, right? Or for some school, an issue in one school but not another.
That's correct. Yeah.
So at any rate, I just kind of throw that out there as
and I don't know what the answer is, and I certainly don't want to represent the whole HSPA or the MSPA on that. I just know that's a battle that I deal with, and I don't have the perfect answer for it. But I do recognize when some of my students are saying, and they're dressed beautifully, and I spent 2 hours, Mr. Grimm, to look like this, and this is very much the culture I identify with. I've given that kid a pass, and if a teacher asks them, I've allowed that kid to wear that.
Sure.
But I will tell you, it makes some of my teachers very upset too, because they're like, well, what's the rule then? What is the rule? And that's a full head covering, and so but that's the dance we'll always dance. I mean, it is.
Well, appreciate the explanation and look forward to further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. We have 2 go-backs. I have to leave, so I'm going to make my comments next, and then Ms. Strauss will take over for the go-backs. And but I do want to say, I think the clarifying information for the parents, I appreciate that happening this year in that section. I think it's a good beginning for this year, and I won't have any changes, but I think it's going to be something that we have to monitor, particularly in light of what the principals are telling us and where we're saying, the facts are there. The social media has changed so drastically and dramatically. So many things in so many ways. And I just want to say to the principals, I thank you for coming out today. I thank you for your candor, telling us directly what you're dealing with and what you're seeing. And while it is our desire to make certain that we are never punitive. We need to ensure that we are guiding these children on the right way, on the right path, and making sure all of our children are safe and secure. So I know that's the battle you face every day. So thank you so much. My next step would be Dr. Brabrand. Dr. Brabrand. My next step would be maybe something unique, because I think Mr. Moon began asking questions to this group of principals that really was interesting and fascinating to all of us. And perhaps we could have a work session where we have a big dialogue with principals, and we talk about this was done contextually with the SR&R, but I think these conversations could highlight various issues. And you're smiling. Were you great minds? Is this a great mind?
I hadn't had a chance yet. After this, I was going to tell Teresa, one of the things that I think we can start to model more is collaborative problem solving with our school-based leaders and school board. And as the superintendent and central office staff, we can facilitate it. The balance is not having the board become the operational directors of that,
right,
but to help you all inform policy. So I'm willing to work with you if you're willing to work with me and try to build what that structure looks like. But I have to tell you, I've been thinking this whole year, every time we have principals in front of this board, it's some of the best discussions.
Correct.
It's some
Always
of the deepest, most thoughtful interactions between board members and staff, and we need to do more, not less of it, to get our system to the next level. So I'm totally into doing it, even around the graduation protocols. I think if we did collaborative, I'd want to create brainstorming and then let a back and forth happen with the people in the room, and we can do more of it, and will.
Well, I appreciate that. So my next step would be, allow Dr. Brabrand to bring forward an idea to us, on how this could be. Of course you were. Of course you did. But I think
I'm living on a prayer,
thank
Ms.
you.
Darnett Colfax.
We're halfway there. I'm going to turn this work session over to Ms. Strauss.
Okay. Thank you. We have two go-backs, Ms. Schultz and Ms. Palchuk.
So I just want to thank the principals for kind of the frankness of the discussion. I think that helps us understand what you're facing. My next step would be something that I've been asking for some time, and I'm going to renew it formally. In fact, I just sent him an email. The Center for Humane Technology was formed out of Silicon Valley by Google and Facebook, et cetera, executives. And Max Stossel is working already in the education space. A lot of what you're seeing, a lot of what's been forced into congressional hearings and whatever, this is work behind the scenes by people who acknowledge what was said so eloquently, which is the devices and the time that the kids spend on them and the way they spend them has now fundamentally shifted the education space. It is fundamentally, this is a archetypal event in all education history that has transpired really within totally the last 10 years, but really in about the last 5 to 8 years. It has been transformational, and not in a good way. And I think we have to bring somebody in at an expert, subject matter expert level to talk with you, to talk with your leadership team, to talk with principals, to talk with us about what is happening in this space. And how do we, people keep saying, well, we need to be a 21st century, educator and put a device in everybody's hands. Maybe that isn't the way, maybe that isn't leading from the front. Maybe being more forward thinking is what he does, which is quite often he goes to school districts, and the very next thing that school district does is make a policy about not allowing phones in the classroom. And what is that potentially transformational in terms of educational leadership of starting to winnow away from this? This got way ahead of us at a policy level, at a behavioral, at a social, emotional, all kinds of things, and it isn't for the better. And I'm renewing formally the request that we bring somebody like that in who knows far more than anybody here, but we're seeing the effects of it. We see it in the discipline office. We see it on the front lines. It flows over into the community, and I think that's really actually much more forward thinking than anything else I think we could come up with as a next step.
Okay, thank you. I have Ms. Balchuk, a quick go back from Ms. McLaughlin, then we will do next steps, and then we need to do our wireless policy.
Okay, thank you. I will try to be brief with my go back. First of all, it's good to hear talk about middle school and SOSAs. I know it's something I've brought up, it's something I've heard about from principals. I believe Ms. Johnson also is very concerned. So I would love to get a plan on that. I don't know if that's the next step, but I know there's discussion. If we could maybe hear from staff what our plan is.
You've been talking to Teresa Johnson.
Please say that, but I was talking to my principals first. Another great principal, Dr. Lehman, who I know has hired a SOSA out of his own, funding trading, and so especially a large middle schools, especially if we really are seeing this trend in 8th and 9th grade, I think it would be very helpful. So I would love to hear that. At this point, the next step I think would be helpful. It's actually interesting to hear talk about the head scarf. Covering scarves, the non-religious side of it. Women from the Women's Law Center actually gave a presentation at the National School Board Association. So while I think it's great that you're addressing it at the school level, I would love to maybe see, is there something for the future that we can look at that would be helpful to try to have some equity of implementation of that across our schools. So that's more of like for next year. Can we review what's being done, what works at a school, and how we could address it, especially trying to keep our girls of color in school, not take them out unnecessarily. And then finally, a quick thing, and this might be a longer conversation. I was looking at, I think, page 21, the disciplinary procedures. I know these are the kinds of things that we get concerned about. Yes. I understand. Yes, parent support. As a parent, I would probably say, wow, that is a lot in there. So for the future, if there is a way to make it pretty clear what to expect, and I don't know if this is something where we can say, if a student heads to the principal's office, can we hand... Yes, and I love it. I think it's a great start. I'm wondering if it can be as easy to read for the future as some of our charts in the previous pages.
Would that flow chart that we were talking about help?
Yes, the flow chart would help. Sorry, I missed that. Yes, I agree with the flow chart. And I don't know if it's possible to have copies of that in the front offices, so if parents or kids are coming in, they know what to expect and they know what will happen. And if for some reason something doesn't happen that way, they can self-advocate as well. So having that very accessible, I don't think they're all carrying this booklet around with them. So I would support that.
Ms. McLaughlin for a quick go back.
Thank you.
Yes, quickly. As much for the three principals in the room, I wanted to let you know that I very much appreciate the work that staff has been doing on the vaping issue. This came to my attention from someone in my district. Very, very serious vaping issues. The child had an adverse reaction because the vaping liquid was not tobacco as the person thought. It was laced with something else and had a very serious reaction to it that required the police involvement and healthcare professionals. Extremely serious and apparently so easily happening in a lot of the bathrooms and just the highly addictive quality of vaping. So I really want to take this opportunity with you all sitting here that when you go to your upcoming principal association meetings and middle school principal association meetings, please know this is on the radar for a lot of us. And I just wanted to publicly express my appreciation to Dr. Lockhart and Teresa Johnson because they sat down with one of my constituents and really had a very heart-to-heart. Ms. Schultz was there in my absence to talk about, what this family's experience was, what we as a division could do. And when it's on the front cover of Time Magazine and USA Today and so many other news sources, just in the last few months alone, this is a national issue. And our SROs, when I've talked to them, have been saying that they're seeing it. So to staff, thank you. Obviously, my big concern was how we could approach it again from a restorative justice mindset, not simply one more thing that we can jam kids up with, but how do we work with our families? And so to that end, I'll shoot an email to staff, but I want to share with my colleagues, in addition to all the good things about prevention efforts for vaping, I really do think we want to do as intentional work as we can with our PTSOs and PTSAs, the FCC PTA, our school board newsletters. I mean, we need to really get out in front of this as much as possible when the fall occurs, to really lead with this, because it's so many, especially high school families, and I'm still one of them for about one more month. We're not aware. We didn't grow up with this, and when you don't grow up with something, you don't even know how to warn your kids about something. So just wanted to kind of really put that emphasis there and express my appreciation.
Okay, can we take a look at the next steps, see where we are? No. Okay, all right, and knowing that we do have one more wireless policy topic we need to cover. Okay, and Ms. Schultz has left the room. Provide better education at SR and R encourage. Yes, please do.
Are we asking for these things to be done before this year's SR&R gets voted on, or are we saying these are things that we should look at as we look at the front of the book and that kind of thing?
And that's a good question. And could we also increase the size of the print, or is that not possible? Because I can't read it.
Because some of these things will, to do it well, we're going to have to take time. And
I guess that would be the question is to Dr. Braybrand, as we did before.
Yes, and what I'd like to be able to do is go back with staff. I have my LT tomorrow and cabinet tomorrow to figure out what we can get done prior to your vote and what may take us more time.
Is everybody take a quick look at that and see, is that, again, a way to handle this, or does anybody have any huge objection? Is Dr. Braybrand will take it back. They will answer what can be done within the time frame. If there is something that you need to have an answer before we vote on the SR&R, which is June 14th. Unless if somebody has anything up there that is absolutely critical, but we need to let staff kind of figure out how long some of it will take. Ms. Corbett-Sanders?
On item 2,
okay.
It included not only the flow chart, but some sort of interactive capability where parents could kind of tap into, this is what I'm dealing with, who do I contact? And so it's within discipline, primarily. It's within the context of the SR&R, and that would also include a button on the individual school sites for access to the ombudsman and access to the regional assistant superintendent. And I think that also, Dahlia, Ms. Palchik, you were talking about it at the end when you went back with some of the same type of concerns. So if you want to look at that and add into it, I would appreciate that.
Yeah, no, I think beyond that, it was just to make it available in every school when students or parents come in.
Just to be clear in terms of the flow chart or whatever, you're talking about what happens in the discipline process?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. The issue with drinking drugs within 30 days of graduation, that's something that it's my understanding that the board members would like to consider that for next year, but not necessarily for this year. Is that correct? Because that would be the one.
Right, we're talking about the alcohol infraction within 30 days
You would like
of
to bring that up
graduation.
for next year's. Okay, so that
break that into 2 because I'd like the recess.
Dr. Braybrand.
Yeah, so I was thinking the 30-day one for next year. Everything else I'd like to review tomorrow at our leadership team meeting, which we have after these work sessions. And I can go, I can do this, I need more time. And I can just put it in Friday's BB to say, here are the ones, and then you all can come back prior to the vote and go, well, I didn't have that, I can't vote for it. Or many I think we can make tweaks and have available for this year. Some are going to take further reflection, brainstorming, putting people together, principals, maybe some of you, and we'll take it a little bit longer.
Okay,
But I'd like to go through that with staff as opposed to spending that time with all the staff, and I don't have everybody that I want. And yes, Stefan and Marianne, you're invited to LT tomorrow at 8:30.
So, okay.
Wait, I'd like clarity on what was just said. So when we were talking about number 7, well, number 3 and number 7 are the same, correct?
I believe that they are, so maybe we
So
can
we
take...
can just delete number 7.
Delete
because
number
mine wasn't
7.
even clear.
Yeah, delete number 7. But there is interest in discussing that for not this particular booklet, but for...
No, that's what she said.
Yeah.
Right, but here's my concern. So this is something that's been brought up for 2 years in a row, and we brought it up again this year. And now we're saying we'll have to consider it again, not for this next coming year, but it'd be for the following year, for fall 2019. And I just feel like, so in other words, it took us 4 years to finally decide if principals can have the latitude to determine whether or not to restrict graduation for an alcohol infraction. I mean, I wish there was something better we can do here, because I don't understand something that is such a small discipline infraction and why.
I guess, Ms. McLaughlin, you could come with that amendment and see if it passes.
All right, so that's what I'll do. I'll just work with staff to see, and Scott, if there's any sort of language that provides latitude so that, even if people are saying, let's try it on a pilot basis or something, and then the other thing for my language, so you can get rid of, so number 7 is fine. Number 8, what other jurisdictions are doing to reduce the number of hearings office cases?
That's a research piece. I would like to just very quickly, people can go through this because we have one more important issue we need to address.
Right. I thought that we were doing is the same thing we did before. We're just handing this list off to Scott, and he can just say,
yes,
I can do this, I can't do that.
Yes.
McLaughlin, are you open for number 3? Because I know our principals want to make sure their schools are safe and that they're still able to keep their kids doing the right thing before graduation. I would love to, at that point, see some research, see if other systems have found other alternatives. I think that would be really helpful for us to see it as well.
I've started some of the dialogue. Look, we started some of it, we talked with HSPA this year. Until we've developed something new, there's still a strong resistance to want to change that, just being honest, putting names.
High school graduation.
Right. Many of the districts that we looked at, and Stefan can speak to this, left the discretion completely with the principal. I think we're too big a system to just go from what we've had to just everybody decide. That's just honestly, I mean, he did the work. I looked at it in the last 30 days. I've got to come up with, I think, something in my own view that would be in between, short of that, but not just each principal gets to decide, or I think we'll be faced with a different set of issues before the board on this topic. Just
okay, one last.
I understand.
Can I give you a principal perspective on that?
Yeah.
We did talk about this at length at high school principals, and there is strong opposition to changing this. When it comes to keeping kids safe, and I did talk about this last year about our girl at Westfield that consumed a water bottle full of vodka, drove on Route 15 and killed a 6-year-old mother of 3. So I feel like anything short of stopping kids from making poor choices, consuming alcohol and coming to school, we need to make sure that we're trying to do that. And I understand that might be a rash case, but in the same sense, it's one of those things where we communicate to communities about, we send out a keep in touch. We go into classrooms and have personal conversations with kids. It's not just prom that falls within that 30-day window. We understand graduation does as well. However, kids coming closer to graduation tend to make poor decisions, not just at prom, but in the school day in general. And I think my colleagues could attest to that too. We have seniors that are really close to graduating that haven't made a discipline infraction in their 4.5 or 3.5 years in high school, all of a sudden decide to do something that's out of character and out of question. So I feel like we need to err on the side of caution with that and really try to make sure that we are trying to keep kids safe as much as we possibly can. And that, to me, is what this regulation does.
So the two toughest conversations I have to have as a principal, the first by far is a parent who's just lost a child and having to call that parent and ask for permission to share information and, check on that parent. That's by far the hardest conversation. So I'm going to say the second conversation is this conversation. And I've been through this a couple of times. And despite all of our best efforts and we even take the attendance of the students who are absent in the government classes and give them a separate letter, and go on the Hawk News, and we look and talk about it and try to frame it as a positive way as possible because it's going into prom season. I just know for a fact, listening to kids talk and having heard kids talk, and I can't throw any numbers at you, but I have had in 15 years conversations with kids. I know kids don't drink on that night. Now, they may get to a hotel room, and it boggles my mind that a parent would get a hotel room for a kid, but they do. But at that point, they're at least not driving, and at that point, I know for a fact kids don't drink because of that rule. I do, and I hate that. I hate that. Trust me, the easy way out for me is to say, well, let's not have the rule, because then I don't have to have the conversations.
I mean, look, I know it's late, and I totally appreciate it. I will just say, because this is where we don't make good policy when we do things on our anecdotes. So yes, I can go to Woodson and say, so they had prom outside of 30 days, and they didn't have alcohol infractions. So what kept the kids from not drinking if graduation was on the table? So this is just one of those complex things. I totally, indulgence to my colleagues and to all of you guys, we're clearly not going to be able to solve it. I'm disappointed, but I really, more than anything, Dr. Brabrand, if we don't make decisions based on what our data is showing us for causality versus correlation, we're going on our best experiences, and it bothers me that there's other school divisions that do it in a different way. The discretion piece is what I like. The kids who do something where it's the first time ever, I don't know how those principals arrive at the decision. The ones where they get behind the wheel and kill somebody, I can't even imagine how heartbreaking it is. But Mr. Thomas, you and I have had the conversation. This is a tough one. Thank you.
2 seconds.
Okay, all right, Ms. Corbett-Sanders.
With the peer number 5, it should be peer mediation, not peer counseling.
Okay, with that, are there any other, Mr. Moon, any other corrections to what's up?
Not the correction, just quick comment that, Mr. Jager, I don't necessarily agree with the one Mrs. McLaughlin has said about use of alcohol by our students within the 30 days from the graduation and potential consequences. I have probably a completely different take on that. So we can disagree on that. I just want you to know that it's not unanimous viewpoint from board.
Okay.
I need to clarify mine up on the board there. So go further down. I think it was on the communications plan. So staff already has a great communications plan. I was just saying that we need to be partnering with our FCC PTA and school board communication vehicles. I just want to make sure that, we're doing things beyond just like the SPS News too. And Mr. Moon, just to your point, I don't believe I said to these principals or to anyone in the microphone that I think anyone agrees with me more than my own personal concern and viewpoint on it. I mean, Ms. Corbett-Sanders spoke to it, but I'm a little confused why you felt the need to single me out and say that you don't agree with me, because nobody said you agreed with me.
Okay, we need to move on. So there is consensus that this will go to Dr. Brabrand and LT, and they will figure out what can be answered short-term, long-term. And if there is anybody who needs something specific in order to vote on June 14th, we will need to work through that. So Thank you all very, very much for this robust discussion, and thank you for our principals. As Dr. Bramer said, our discussion is great when we have our principals with us. So we will give about 2 minutes, and then we will go forward with the wireless communication.